Today, you can vote for your favorite question, and this will be asked in priority. Andrina, maybe if you can mute yourself so we don't have any echo in the background. Thank you. For the panelists discussion, we will ask the question to the panelists, but we will also write them in the Q&A. And you, the audience, you can contribute to your reaction on the policy paper or any recommendation that you have for policymakers on VNFIL policies and volunteering. We will write the question in Q&A, and then you can answer below this question. And during the open discussion, you will also have another opportunity to contribute by raising your hands, and then we can unmute you at this moment. So now I will leave the floor to our first speaker for today, who is Jo Pieters from the Netherlands and Others Foundation. Andrina, yeah, well, great. And Brikena, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Jo Pieters. I represent Others Foundation from the Netherlands, and we are one of the partners in the ImproVal project. We are the partner who was responsible for writing this policy paper, but of course we did it together with the other partners. And if you have seen the policy paper, some of you might think, I have seen this before, or I've read this somewhere before. And that's right, because we started to develop this policy paper last autumn in October, and it was presented at the CEV conference in Brussels in November. And we also, that was the first draft, and also we have submitted this first draft as it was then called a position paper in the framework of the evaluation of the validation policy of the European Commission. So we've come a long way from October until now to present this policy paper, and this might still not be the final version, because depending on today's discussion, we might improve or add some things to the policy paper. And we are also considering to add something from the evaluation of the validation policy paper, because the European Commission published a research report recently in which they describe what has been done on validation since 2012. And we will have a look at that study report and see if we can add something to this policy paper. Yeah, for those of you who know a bit more about the project, or for those of you who attended the two webinars last week, we mainly looked back at what has been done on validation in the voluntary sector since 2012. And today we will try to look forward. Okay, having seen what has been done, what can be the next steps, and how can we improve the next steps, and also how can we avoid to repeat things that have already been done. So what we want to do with this policy paper is to, first of all, to show the position of the voluntary sector, because I think that during the last 7 or 8 years, we as voluntary sector, we have showed that, yes, validation is important for us. And also, yes, we can play a role in developing validation tools. We also want to contribute, we hope to contribute to more coherence and synchronization, because what we have seen, and that was already mentioned in last week's webinars, what we've seen is that many times the wheel was reinvented, or the people tried to push the door that was already open, talking about developing validation tools, for example. So we think if we try to look at more cooperation, then we can support new initiatives in this field. Next slide, please. Yes, what has been done so far? More than, as far as we have discovered, and we might have missed some, but there have been, since 2012, more than 25 projects dealing with validation in the voluntary sector. Most of these projects were financed within the framework of the Erasmus Plus program, and most of the projects were dealing with developing the validation tools. And more than, as you see, more than 50 different organizations were involved, and they were based in 20 member states, which means that we already have a fairly good base in the European Union to think of next steps. And yes, 40 validation tools, and on our project website, ImproVal.eu, you can find description of most of these validation tools. Next slide, please. But the fact that there are so many tools, and the fact that so many organizations are involved, and that so many countries are involved, does not mean that we are there, because we also tried to find out, okay, which tools are working and which are not, and which tools are used and which are not. And what we often see is, no, we see mainly two things. One thing is that for many tools, it's hard to find out how many volunteers are using the tools. And it's also hard to, and we also see that very often when it's developed in the framework of a project, as soon as the project stops, the tool stops, or the tool stays online, but people are not giving it much dissemination or attention. So that's, yeah, we think that's a big loss of time, money, and energy. So that's a pity. Also, we have seen that many projects are isolated in the way that, of course, the project partners are involved, the target groups of the project partners are involved, but if there's one project developing a validation tool for volunteers in youth work, and if there's another project developing validation tools for example, for refugees, there are not that many connections. At least we haven't found these. That can be done better in the future, we think. And last but not least, there are many developments on the EU level in the validation field, and here some are mentioned as such as Europass, European guidelines, and so on. And we think that these European developments can be of value for validation in the voluntary sector. And if we pay more attention to these developments, we think that can strengthen the power of the validation tools that we develop. Next slide, please. So what should be done? First of all, I think we should think of ways to create bridges between projects. That's also a complicated point, because let's give an example from the Netherlands. When we started the ImproVal project, we asked to our Erasmus Plus national agency, can you tell us which other projects dealing with validation in the voluntary sector are running in Europe or will start soon? And their answer then, and now I talk about 2 or 3 years ago, their answer then was, no, we cannot tell you, because we as Dutch national agency are only responsible for, are only informed about projects that are based in the Netherlands. So yes, creating bridges between projects makes sense, we think, because they can support and strengthen each other. But we would have to think about how to do that, because apparently the Erasmus Plus agencies are not doing this, unless they will pay attention to it in the new program, which will start in January. Making use of the existing infrastructure is also important to strengthen validation in the sector. And by this we mean that it's important even before starting a project, even before starting to write the application, to think who will be the best partner organization in this project to make sure that the results will be used. Again, to give an example from our own experience, we have done projects with some local volunteer centers all over Europe because they were interested or involved in the validation, but they were only working on the local level, which means that on a local level you get much attention, but if you want to spread it throughout the country or maybe even to other countries, then the possibilities were very limited. And of course, we have some important platforms on European level, like the European Volunteer Center, the Life and Learning Platform, Voluntary. In many countries, we already have national volunteering platforms or similar organizations. And we think that it makes sense that in new projects, to involve these national and European platforms in a more structural way, so that you can be sure that the message and the outcomes are spread further than just the local or the regional level. The important thing is the connection between the developments at national level. And here we talk about developments in the field of validation. As some of you might know, CEDEFOP is mainly responsible for developing validation on European level. And I think every 2 or 3 years they present country reports. And the last one is from 2019, I think. And so, and in these country reports, they describe what is the state of affairs talking about validation in all member states. This shows that many member states already have a validation system or are developing it. And we think that you can strengthen your own validation process in the voluntary sector by creating connections with validation in general in your country. So if you start a new project or if you want to develop new tools, we think it makes sense to first have a look what is already there, not only in the voluntary sector, but also what is happening on validation in general in my country, and connect with these developments and also connect with the people who are responsible for it. I think that's it. Next step, next slide, please. Yeah, that's it. Okay. That's the summary. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation of this policy paper. I also remind you that if you want to introduce yourself, you can share it to all participants. I saw, for instance, that Christina and Margherita, you wrote only to the speakers. So just a little reminder. And also for social media, my colleague also shared our platform. So if you want to contribute also on these platforms, you're welcome to. So now we'll invite our speakers to react to this policy paper. And Erika, if you can also share now the first question in the Q&A section, so that the audience can also contribute to this question with their comments, inputs, and recommendation. So my question to the first speaker is, what is your reaction on this policy paper? Is there something missing? Do you agree, disagree? Do you have any other recommendation? And I will first give the floor for 2-3 minutes to Anushka Ferrari. Hello, Anushka.
Hello, hi, how are you doing?
Good, and you? Can you just
Fine.
introduce yourself just for 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Nuska Ferrari and I work at DG Employment, and I work specifically on the dossier of validation. I joined the unit of skills and qualifications in January this year. So it's quite a new topic for me in a way, but I've been working on education, and in particular on digital education, for about 15 years. I think it's a very exciting time for validation in a way, because we're soon going to publish the staff working document that accompanies the new skills agenda, that will bring along the result of not only the evaluation that Joe was mentioning, but also the open consultation, that open public consultation that we had on validation. And to reply to your question, I think that this paper is important to be shared, but also to be completed, as it has several points that need to be taken into account, and that I was happy to see brought here to this discussion. So I think that there are interesting examples of the general field of volunteering and volunteering contributing to the validation dossier. I think that what comes out of the paper and from the presentation that Joe gave, and thank you, Joe, for this presentation, is the fact that the volunteering sector is a very wide sector, is a sector where variety is probably also an added value. And I think that what is important is that this fits probably the main aspects of validation. So when we see validation as a practice, validation has to have the individual at the center. And the volunteering sector goes and touches upon an audience and groups of individuals that would not benefit from general validation arrangements. So I think that this is coming out from the paper in some ways, but it's not so explicit. So I'm replying to both sides of the question. So what is there and what can be added? So this is in a way a limit of validation in the third sector and in volunteering, but is also one of its positive sides. So I think that in general terms, it would be difficult to find a balance between the specificity of the volunteering sector, but also the need to connect and bridge with other sectors. So education and training on one hand, and employment on another. What I'm saying is that there are many initiatives that are grassroots in volunteering, and it could be a bit hard to lose this variety and this granularity if we think of systematic validation arrangements for this sector, let's say. In terms of the paper, I think, as I was saying before, it's very interesting. Maybe one of the limitations that we generally have when we talk about validation is that we talk to an audience that is already aware of what's going on. So probably the paper could benefit from having a general introduction, so that other people who are not so expert in validation could understand what is going on in the sector. So probably an introduction, just one page to situate the concept of validation could help. And I think I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much, Anushka. And you rightly pointed out that an important document is going to come out in more or less 1 week, so on the 1st of July, together with the revised skill agenda on the validation of non-formal and informal learning. And we do hope that volunteering, or the third sector as it is often referred to, will have a good place in this paper. Now I will ask Andrina. So I see that your video issue hasn't been solved. Can you unmute yourself and let us know what do you think about this paper?
Okay, sorry, they told me my video was solved, so I don't know. Am I speaking?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, everyone, and a lovely afternoon, midsummer here in Ireland. Our days are long and the sun just never stops. Joe, I really enjoyed that presentation. And I think it's so lovely when you hear something spoken. One of the things that really struck me from it that I didn't get when I read the papers, which I really enjoyed, by the way, was that the issues that you pull out in terms of both the specificity, the challenges around connectivity, and the adoption and adaption of EU instruments are challenges that face just about every sector. Everybody likes to invent their own special solution because after all, we're all special. And what happens for me is very different really than what happens for you. And so everyone that, certainly from a national perspective that QQI works with, we hear this story again and again. So the story you're telling resonates with just about everyone. And what was lovely in the way you told it was that you surfaced that in a really delightful way. And I think one of the things that we all need to do is to recognize within the European instruments the fact that they're not difficult and they're not technical, but that they are enablers. And to pull out in our communication strategies, and this is something that I think, again, going to the important question that Pauline asks us, is one of the things that really did strike me, and it's a challenge for us nationally, regardless of sector, but particularly when you're reaching out to the wealth of the community and voluntary sectors, is this challenge around guidance and a communication strategy, and the absence of communication strategies around validation. And that involves a whole series of challenges. It involves managing expectations for what it can do, managing expectations around the outcomes of it, and informing us about the ways that it works. And one of the things in preparing for this, talking to many of our leading national volunteering organizations, they felt very strongly that it was very important to consider our next steps in the context of COVID-19 and what is for Ireland nationally the challenge of 52% youth unemployment within a really vibrant youth population. Now that's pretty staggering figures, where a very recent survey indicated that 70% of young people were challenged by concerns about their mental and physical health issues. And in that context, a volunteer sector that has literally boots on the ground in every single community, which is what volunteering does, and which were key to the vital role in caring for vulnerable citizens at really local level throughout our emergency, and right across Europe, I think that was the case, where the impacts of emergencies are not felt equally. And I think that needs to come out too in terms of the infrastructure that we put around validation and how we work for that. So I think that that's one of the things. We're very pleased that in our new programme for government that we see a plan for a strategy for volunteering, plan around supports for the community and voluntary sector to recover and enhance the impacts post-COVID, but also a plan to develop and implement a standardised system of accreditation of prior learning. And we anticipate that that will include opportunities for young people to connect very closely with employment. We know that there are already through the National Youth Council things like the skills summary and things that provide for initial summaries and that work with the 2 of the 4 stages in validation, and that we think will be compatible with Europass, the new Europass decision and so on. So there's a lot in it that we think that we can do, but collaboration is really, really important in that it allows everyone to play to their strengths. And that can be different. So I think there's a lot in this that we can unpack and that we can build with, but it's building that deeply, deeply respectful set of relationships, I think, that we need to work to. So thank you, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Andrina. You rightly point out that validation in volunteering is especially beneficial for young people. And I think that with this crisis, we have seen a lot of enthusiasm from young people to go volunteering and to help the neighbors, for instance. They have been developing competencies. And yeah, as you mentioned, the context in Ireland, and it's also the case in other countries, there's a lot of youth unemployment, and that could be one of the solution for these young people to show that they have acquired competencies, that they learned a lot, and they could value this in the labor market. But without opening the discussion to another discussion, I will now ask Gabriela to comment on the paper.
Thank you, Pauline. And one of the comments I was going to make about the paper actually is that for me, it was quite refreshing that it didn't focus on youth or give the impression that validation is only for youth. And I was going to thank Jo and all the colleagues for that, because very often there is what I would consider to be a misconception that validation is something for young people, and in a lot of the communication that is lacking. Somebody else mentioned that, but in the communication that does exist, it tends to give the impression that this is only something relevant for young people. And what we promote and what I liked about this paper is it gives a far more holistic approach, that this validation system can be relevant for volunteers of whatever ages. And I think that's a really important message, that volunteers of all ages can benefit from validation. One thing that I missed, and it was the topic of a PLA, peer learning activity that we hosted last year, I think, was about the different systems and attitudes in place to what we might call soft and transversal skills and hard skills acquired through volunteering. So very often, if you learn, I don't know, a specific computer skill, this is much more easier to find a pathway to validation than if we speak about soft and transversal skills such as creativity or empathy, which we know are very highly valued by employers in the labor market. But because there is no corresponding, in most cases, no corresponding formal education qualification, the validation process is much more difficult. So validation where there is a corresponding formal education qualification is much more easy. Where there isn't, it's much more difficult. And I think that's a reflection that we've seen across Europe. And I maybe it's there in the paper, you can correct me, but I didn't see this this kind of contrast and comparison, not to put all things in one basket. The other thing that I miss specifically with regard to the volunteering sector is that we need to make validation part of the normal duties of a volunteer manager. And this again is a communication and training exercise, that we need to communicate and train the people who train the managers, that validation should become part of the process, and also that we have a double sound of my of the webinar here. To make validation part of the volunteer manager process, this would be very important. And I think this was the main issues on the actual paper that I missed. But otherwise, it's a great document. It's built on what you already presented in our conference in November. That was also very much appreciated, and with some additional information, maybe with some more context, as Anushka mentioned, if people happen to come upon the policy document in isolation of other things. But otherwise, it's a really useful document and really useful contribution to this overall debate and process that we're all involved in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And thank you to all the speakers for your reaction on this policy paper. So we will integrate it in the policy paper, and within a couple of weeks, we will send it again as a final version. And I also encourage the audience to give their recommendations. So what can we do, or what can policymakers do to improve the validation in the voluntary sector? It could be funding issue. We haven't approached this. It could be including volunteering or the third sector in the validation strategies, etc., etc. So please answer the Q&A if you can. that my colleague has written. Erika has written the first question, so you should be able to type your answer below this and give your recommendation on the policy paper. So now we're moving to our second question for the discussion today. The second question is, so we have had the EU inventory on the validation of non-formal and informal learning by CDFOP, as well as the now recently published external study on VNFIL that was commissioned by the Commission. And they both highlight the lack of progress regarding cross-sector cooperation between the formal education sector, the labor market, and the third sector. There hasn't been much progress in the last decade. So to all of you, what would be your recommendation to improve this collaboration between all the sectors? For instance, could be for improving the shared understanding between the stakeholders, to have more VNFIL comprehensive policies. And also to the audience, you can again answer in Q&A, and maybe you have a good example. Andrina from Ireland, I know that you're also part of the RPL, so the Recognition for Prior Learning Practitioner Network. How have you been collaborating with the labor market sector and the third sector?
Hi again. We've had, actually I've dug even deeper on that since Pauline and I spoke last week. We have a practitioner network in Ireland, which has about 280 members. And that includes members from the volunteering and from the community education sector. On our national steering group, which is a group of volunteers, AIMTUS, which is the national learners representative body, but also the advocacy group for community education generally, they're on our steering group. So they speak and officially represent that sector, and we're looking to extend and develop that area of representation to include other volunteering groups. We're currently revising the terms of reference and so on to look at developing that and strengthening it. The second area with that is when we have network meetings, we invite case studies from practitioners. And one of the areas that it comes across again is that the notion of volunteering itself isn't free. There can be an assumption that to volunteer doesn't require resourcing and doesn't require systems and frameworks themselves. So there's been a fair bit of debate around that. And then as Gabriella mentioned, the notion of, well, how do you volunteer? How do you record the learning that actually occurs through volunteering work? And then in very practical terms, we have collaboration on the ground between both formal and volunteering sectors, both in further education or VET, and with higher education. And that has pulled out some really interesting initiatives, including for access to higher education and for exemptions within higher education programs, which access to higher education can be highly competitive here. And so one of the technological sector colleges provides bonus points in access for people from the volunteering sector in creative arts and so on, which would be largely for adult learners, but typically coming through the VET sector. And a very, very interesting process there. In another example that was given was for parish councils, people who work at very much at ground level, but in a very mixed variety of roles. So that could be anything from looking after, visiting people who are sick, visiting people who are isolated, doing banking work and fundraising and all sorts of the various administrative work that would be associated with maintaining a local community group that's faith-based effectively. And one of the people again points to what Gabriella was talking about in terms of structures and roles and understanding your organization as you sustain it, and some of the work then that goes with the Irish Charities Foundation and the governance systems that go with that. And the phrase that was given to me was, it's like going to the wardrobe and thinking you've nothing to wear until you actually begin to structure what's in there. And once that's done, it makes the work of validation actually fairly straightforward and easy to do. And some voluntary groups are well equipped to do that and others are not. And that's where the question of building bridges between the formal and non-formal sectors or informal sectors, or comes into play. So that the collaborative work plays to each other's strengths. So we've got lots going on in a very, very typically Irish way. It's organic, it's from the ground up, and the enthusiasm comes from the ground up, rather than from a top-down way. But also then the skills summary piece is driven by Accenture, and funded by the Department of Employment and Youth Affairs. And that's again a really interesting piece of work, because it allows for the identification and documentation of 12 areas of skills and working with young people. So again, it covers the cradle to grave spectrum of voluntary work that happens in every community. So really, really interesting stuff there, I think, in terms of just policy and practice working hand in hand to provide for recognition and validation. It does also cover the transversal skills. We have very high levels actually of recognition of transversal skills, because they do exist within our framework itself as level indicators, but also the EU core competences allow for those to be documented both as broad standards and as specific standards, again right across the framework, and are digitally recognized, including through an initiative called Write On, which anybody can do remotely, and that covers for adult basic skills, and you can get your skills accredited simply by just going online and working through the process. And a very significant number of people achieve recognition, achieve their awards through the recognition of prior learning, including in transversal skills areas, and then for other areas through a whole suite of different tools, going back to Yo's point, in various other ways. But the issue tends to become about if I want to be a medic or to be a paramedic or whatever, there's no point in my developing skills as a plumber in my volunteering world and then expecting to be recognized as a medic. So there's an element, and that's where the communications and the understanding, the guidance piece comes into play. You need to understand the purposes for which your validation can be applied.
Thank you very much, Andrina, for sharing these inspiring examples from Ireland. I will now leave the floor to Gabriela to give us your thoughts.
Thank you. About the collaboration, yes, it's not easy for sure. I don't have many, if any, positive stories to share. Just that for me, the key piece missing in all of this story, and I think as policymakers and as stakeholders, practitioners, we have come much closer together and gained a much closer understanding during this whole period since 2012. Where we are really consistently missing is from the point of view of the employers. So whether that's from the point of view of SMEs or big companies, is really trying to understand from them what kind of tools would be useful. Many of the bigger companies have their own internal kind of validation tools, so they are not so interested in what we might prepare from outside from external stakeholders. So maybe SMEs is a more useful partnership to establish, but if people have ideas, suggestions how we could involve better employers in this journey and really make sure that this is also a bottom-up preparation from their side, at least from our side, we would be very willing and happy to involve them more. That's always really been a challenge. In terms of a good practice example, because we also tend to see the issue we see it also in the DGs in the European Commission, and we see it in the ministries in the member states, that very often the ministry who is dealing with validation is not the ministry who is dealing with volunteering. And the communication between those two ministries or those two departments is often very limited, or in some case non-existent. I can give the example in Spain, where this was very much the case, that it was the Ministry of, I think at the time would have been Social Services and Family Affairs or something like that, actually funded and developed with the volunteering sector a validation tool called Vol Plus, which is in addition to the Passport Bénévole in France, I think the only one in Europe that's officially kind of sponsored and supported by a government agency. But in actual fact, the people dealing with validation in the Ministry of Employment had nothing to say or nothing to contribute or nothing to promote about this tool when they were promoting validation in the normal sense. We did hear in a last EQF Advisory Council meeting, actually probably the last one just before the lockdown, that now the Ministry of Employment were also going to start to address volunteering and the volunteering sector in their communication, in their discourse, and strengthen these links with the ministry responsible for volunteering. So that is really good news, that with some will and some positive action, that these closer collaborations can take place. To finish on not such a good note, on a word of warning and some flags that we are hearing from across Europe, and this is something that we've brought up also consistently, is how particularly employment agencies and employment counsellors deal with volunteering and the possibility of seeing volunteering as a way to gain skills and then eventually to validate those skills. And actually we see people working in employment agencies actively discouraging people from volunteering, telling them, and it is the case, that if they volunteer, they will lose their access to financial support, they will lose their access to training. So instead of seeing volunteering as a complementary solution to them actively finding work, they are actually told and discouraged that they cannot volunteer. There is now a lot of fear with this rising unemployment in Europe that this situation is going to continue, and actually the volunteering, as a volunteering sector, we are going to lose very many important and crucial volunteers, because they will be engaged now with looking for employment, and if the employment agencies are not encouraging them and supporting them to volunteer also as a complementary measure to their job searching, then this is going to be not only damaging to the individual people concerned, but also damaging to the volunteering sector. So we really hope the employment agencies can have a different attitude and a different approach, and really understand that volunteering and learning through volunteering particularly, but also for support to mental health and support to social connections and networking connections for employment, that volunteering can be very important. Not to go too far the other way, that volunteer organizations are seen as a solution to the unemployment problem, that unemployed people are pushed into the voluntary sector, and that the voluntary sector is somehow left to deal with training people when they're not financed to do that, when they're not equipped to do that, when they are not supported to do that. So balance has to be found, but we really look forward to seeing how, also with the help of DG EMPL from the European level, that we can really talk to the employment agencies and explain that volunteering is not a hindrance to looking for work, but is actually a supporting measure to looking for work, and see if we can't change some of the practices and some of the attitudes that we see across Europe on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for raising this important issue. It's true that we mentioned the labor markets, thinking in the back of our head of the private labor market, but there are also other stakeholders that deal with the labor markets in the employment agency, and they really need to be, for the awareness to be raised in the future on volunteering. So thank you really for raising this part. Now we'll give the floor to Anushka.
So thank you very much. I will just add a few things. I think that the intervention of Andrina and Gabriela have been very, very interesting in highlighting well some of the opportunities that there are in this sector, but also some of the limitation. So you were referring to the your question, Pauline, sorry, to the inventory and also to the external studies that we commissioned. And I think there is this fact of the integrated approaches to validation that is at the heart of what we are doing now, especially with the EQF AG. So we had an online meeting with the EQF AG last week, where we presented a note on validation that was actually referring to this integrated approach. So how to support cooperation between third sector, employment, and education and training. Now, I think that with the note we raised more questions than answers, so I cannot really come here and suggest good practices or good examples that could support the integration of the volunteering sector to other aspects like labor market and education and training in validation terms. I think that at the European level there are several things that can be done. So not just keep on working with the inventory, for instance, to gather information on how this is happening in different member states. Across the three sectors, but also through the use of Europass that was mentioned just here before. We are going to have the launch of the new Europass in July this year, and I think that in the years to come, in the months, but also in the years to come, validation probably will be given a bigger space also into this instrument. And I think this is important, not only because it provides citizens with a way of showing and capturing their different skills and abilities that are also developed through volunteering, but also hopefully in changing mentalities and ways of seeing volunteering and other experiences for employability, also, as Gabriela was saying, as a supporting measure that would lead to better employability. Now, the guidelines were also mentioned. So this is a document that was first developed in 2009 by CEDEFOP with the support of the Commission, of course. There was an update in 2015, and we're working towards a new update, hopefully to be ready by the end of next year. I was reading in the policy paper that Joe presented a sentence that struck me. Joe, you wrote, well, the group wrote that the voluntary sector is not always aware of the guidelines that are there on validation. And I was wondering if something can be done to improve this. So not just to raise awareness among the voluntary sector stakeholders, but also maybe to make the guidelines more relevant for the voluntary sector. Yeah. So in this aspect as well, I just have questions. I don't have answers. I don't have solutions. But I think we're very open in listening to the different stakeholders and understanding how the guidelines can be improved. I think now is the right time, not only because we are working towards revising the guidelines, but also because with this period of lockdown, of crisis, there would be, of course, effects that will be seen in employment and employability. But I think it's also time maybe to look at change and how we can support change at system level. Thank you.
Also for bringing updates about the work of, so the EQF, for those who don't know what it is the European Qualification Framework, in which member states representatives meet with together with stakeholders to discuss the qualification, the validation of non-formal and formal learning, the developments like Europass and so on. I don't know if Gabriela, you wanted to say something about Europass in the meeting you mentioned.
Yes, I can just mention, if people are now looking at the new Europass when it's launched and looking for volunteering, unfortunately, due to a series of circumstances, volunteering is not mentioned in the first available version of the new Europass. We understood from the European Commission that this will be the case in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we hope. So when volunteering is included there, or skills acquired, there will be a section on volunteering, which you can put your volunteering experience, you can put the skills acquired through volunteering, you can put all your contextual references to volunteering in that section. That will be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks, as I understood, but not available at the launch point. So those of us who are interested in that, please, I hope, don't be disheartened. It will eventually be there, as I understood. I don't know if Anushka has something to answer, but yeah, it will be there soon. And then we, as a network, will then do a big communication strategy around once the volunteering section is there.
Indeed, thanks for mentioning that. It just escaped me. I should have mentioned it, but thanks for this update. And I think that it's also important to have your feedback, meaning the feedback of all stakeholders, on how to improve even this version, because it's an evolving tool, so we need to understand how to contribute to the common good and how to make it better fit the different needs of all of our stakeholders. Now, there is just another point that I would like to add, please, just 1 second. I think that, Joe, before you made a very good point when you were talking about the different tools and project that you reviewed, and I think this is a big question that we have in Erasmus project, how to tackle the sustainability of projects. Now, there are issues that we cannot face, because if you want to ensure the sustainability of the project, there is a problem, of course, with having the same consortia benefiting from European funds. So this is a problem that is not solved at the moment, but I think there is a very big problem, and Andrina was mentioning this before, which is a problem of communication. So also understanding how through European project we are progressing on a dossier. This is something that is important to gather, and it's important that we make this communication effort so that everyone is on the same board and we don't always start from scratch. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. And ImproVal is answering to this issue, because it has collected all the European projects and put it on the same unique platform. So I encourage you to visit the website. Now we have only 2 minutes left. So if the audience would like to take to speak orally and say something, a question to our speakers, now is the moment. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you. I will wait a second. And if no one from the audience wants to speak, I will then conclude on this webinar. It's almost 4:30. So thank you very much for the speakers and the audience for attending. And with you, we will now work on integrating all these inputs from the speakers and the comments on the policy paper in the paper, and we will share it afterwards. And it was the last webinar of our series on valuing competencies in volunteering. I also want a special thanks to all those, I mean, if there are who attended the 3 webinars. I see now we have someone from the audience. McKenna, can you unmute Lefranc? And Andrina, can you mute yourself, because we can hear some. Thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I'm Michel Lefranc. I'm from France Bénévolat in France. And I would like to just very shortly come back to what has been said concerning the link between volunteering and employment agencies. We've had a long debate in France on this question. And what has happened is that nowadays the employment agencies are working on volunteering, and they have recognized volunteering. And that is a huge step in France. The second point is the question of validation of volunteering by the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education in France copes with 80% of all validation of diplomas. And therefore, there has been a very narrow work between the associations concerned with volunteering and the Ministry of Education. And so now we have been working and are working further on the question of validation of prior learning, VAE in France. And this is working rather very well. There is even a push by the Ministry of Education to validate the work of volunteers in France. And I hope that what is happening, these two positive aspects in France, can help other countries.
Thank you very much for your contribution and to share the story of France. So there was no question. So indeed, that would be the last word for this webinar. Thank you again to all of you. I just also wanted to mention that you will receive an open badge as an award for your participation to this webinar. Open badge, or like digital credential. It's a new emerging validation tools. So we thought it was quite relevant to give you this for this webinar. And you can always be in touch with the lifelong learning platform if you have other ideas or recommendations or comments on this policy paper or the work that is being done at the European level in volunteering. And I wish you good holidays. I think now is the time to start wishing good holidays. Thank you all for attending and see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Pauline. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. God bless. Bye.